one thing I would like to say is that this story began actually before we did any observations. That was, I guess, early on, it was Fred Tilley, the first who came down to explore the migration. Am I right, Steve?
Yeah, I asked him to go down there on behalf of Hawkwatch International, do some exploration, and he actually chose to do that in the spring. But I think I can't remember if he also went down in the fall, but I think most of his observations were in the spring.
Yes, my recollection is that Fred Tilley did all of his work in spring. Before that, back in the early 1980s, there was a Frenchman here, Jean-Marc Thiollet, who did some work for the then projected nuclear power plant. He was a Raptor person, and he was doing he was participating as part of the environmental impact assessment of the nuclear plant. And he did spend a lot of time in the Palmasola Road, which is the road that Fred Tilley and his wife Kathy used many years after. And he collected interesting observations about the migration, and he published a couple of papers in a French small journal. And I have copies of those papers somewhere, but it was just a standard description of migration and the promise of impressive numbers flying by. But it was until Fred came down that the possibility of this being a very, very important flyway came up. There was also an account from the late 1960s in Ralph Palmer's books. He wrote about the encounter of one of his friends in Veracruz City back in the late 1960s, about the migration he observed during 2 days around Veracruz City. But before that, we didn't know much. I mean, there was the early report of Frank Chapman in 1897, telling people that he saw countless numbers of robin hawks. He recorded osprey and swallowtail kites, but there wasn't much known before we started our work. I don't know if you want to add anything, Lori.
No, I think you encapsulated it. I mean, I could mention that I think it was in '89 that I went down there, or maybe it was '90. I'm trying, '89. You know, okay.
'89, yes.
Yeah, and I think this was because of Steve and I had talked about what Tilley was finding, and I was looking for, you know, vacation. Thought it would be a fun vacation to go down and see what kind of migration we could find. So my fiance at the time and I went down in the spring and checked out that Palmasola Road. Saw this Volkswagen full of young men going by in the middle of this road that didn't seem like it was passable. And I saw they had binoculars and thought, and then they zoomed on, and I think we were there for less than a week, but we spent time first up there, but then we moved down to that the highway that goes by Chichi, and we just pulled off the side of the road, different places, and watched hawks, and found that that was a lot easier on our car than driving that sandy road. But yeah, we were very excited and had a good observations when we were there.
And you know, one question for you, Ernesto, is what role Hawkwatch International and Hawk Mountain played in the early stages to help motivate and inspire you and your Mexican team to begin to explore the flyway in greater detail, with you being up on the shoots in the fall of 1989 and then being an intern for Hawk Mountain in 1990. How do you think that maybe contributed to your inspiration for really getting down to nailing this thing down there in Veracruz?
Good question, Steve. It's a world of difference. I mean, early on, our interest was to find the places where we could observe the migration. We weren't interested in doing a scientific study or work on conservation or anything like that. We were interested in hawk watching and enjoying the large numbers of birds. Just the joy of seeing it, which is, I guess, what brings most hawk watchers to hawk watchers anyway, is how the whole thing started. And we knew that it had sparked an interest in you and Hawkwatch International. You took us up to the Goshut Mountains. Me and Sergio were invited by you. With our broken English, we set up a time and a plan to go to the Goshuts, and we traveled by bus to Salt Lake City and met two Hawkwatch International staff persons there that took us up to the Goshuts. So we had several discussions there when we met you in that big tent where the kitchen was and all the food was stored in the equipment and the nets and the whole thing. We had several discussions there about what we could do with this very interesting flyway. Sergio and I came back just in time to go to the Raptor Research Foundation meeting in early October in Veracruz City, a meeting that was organized by Mario Ramos and Eduardo Íñigo. And we gave a paper there. At the time, scientific conferences were a little more laid back than they are nowadays. And but we caught the attention of Jim Bednarz, whom at the time was the director of science in Hawk Mountain. And he handed me paperwork to request to apply for an internship. And so I went the following year, the fall of 1990, went up to Hawk Mountain. I didn't have a chance to work with Jim Bednarz, but was luckier to work with Lori, whom I met upon arriving there. And Lori was my supervisor. I was working on a red-tailed hawk migration project. And throughout the fall, we had many opportunities to discuss the possibility of starting a season-long migration count down at the coast. And Lori probably remembers a lot of those days in the fall of 1990.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was late in the fall that we actually kind of sat down around a table, me and Ernesto and Jim Brett, our curator at the time. And I think we brought Steve in on the phone. And we talked about maybe collaborating on a scientific study of the migration in that area. And we were focused on the spring because that was when most people had been collecting data already. So so we agreed to do it. Cynthia Lenhart was executive director at Hawk Mountain at the time, and she was very supportive. I do remember, I don't know if I've told you guys this, but it had to get cleared by the Hawk Mountain Board Science Committee that for us to go ahead, because we were going to use some Hawk Mountain money, which at that time was very small bit of money to do the count. I think it was like $2,500 or something. And then we were also proposing to pay for one of Hawk Mountain's experienced counters, and then Hawkwatch would do the same to send somebody down. And I do remember that Frank Gill, who was our chair of our science committee, was really not in favor of it. And it was only because Cynthia was in favor of that I was able to win him over. And because he really didn't think that we should be working down in Mexico for some reason, but we ended up going for it, and thankfully, and Steve put up the same amount of money, and or Hawkwatch International did, and then we went forward. So I guess you guys were living on beans and rice or something with that $2,000, but it got a start. For the spring of 1991 was the first field season.
Well, Laura, I did not remember that you had to overcome the skepticism of Frank Gill.
It was a lot for me at the time, but I did persevere. So I'm sure he takes it back now.
We had Jim Brett on our side, which is important. True. So he was always backing Lori there. He was enthusiastic about the idea. mostly because he wanted to beat his friend Josie Leshem in Israel on finding more hawks during a migration season. He later told me that when I faxed him our count results, he will take the fax and resend it to the Israeli people to get jealous about the numbers that we were getting. And I guess they were rough with one another about this important site that we're just discovering in those early years.
Well, I that sounds just like Jim Brett.
Yep. But yeah, so the first season, 1991, you had 4 count sites, Ernesto, or 5?
4 count sites. We had we didn't know how broad the migration front was. We had to forget about what we had learned about migration when we started our work here in Veracruz. First of all, this idea that spring migration was better to track the migration came out of papers that we had read from Panama and the impression of Fred Tilley spending time in Chiapas. During the fall, which is our rainy season, and the rainy season in Panama as well, it's very difficult to track the migration because the skies are overcast. Migrants often get mixed with the clouds. It's easy to lose track of flocks. And for some reason, we thought we couldn't track the migration in the fall season. So we kept insisting on doing spring counts. And it was until we did our first season-long count in 1992 that we discovered that the fall was just as promising and as good as spring or even better. The other thing that we had to unlearn was the idea that migrants will be migrating along ridges, which is something that we had read all over the place. And we spent a lot of the early years, all the way from 1987, 88 or so. We were trying to find good places along the Sierra Madre Oriental to track the migration. We have this massive mountain range sort of running parallel to the Gulf Coast. And those were the most boring days here. We could record, very few migrants in a day. And we thought we were missing something because we knew that down at the coast was where the action was.
Well, spring we funded on a shoestring, but then the fall of 1992 was when we really got some notable funding from Fish and Wildlife Service and National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And I had sent you guys the photo of the first proposal. I still have it in my files. Being a pack rat can be good sometimes. And
yeah, that was fun to receive that, Laurie. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll have to scan it in. But that was really important because it gave us, we spent some time over that winter in fall of 1991 and winter 1992, kind of really thinking about, okay, what are the big questions? And I think we broke it down into 3 areas. One is, what are the birds going through there, the count. And we knew we wanted to start some environmental education right away to try to improve the awareness of raptors in the local communities. And then thirdly, we really wanted to focus on the roost sites. We didn't know, you guys had observed all these flocks in the spring of 91, but we didn't really know where they were going and whether there was any habitat conservation needed to protect those areas. So I think those were the 3 big ones, right, Ernesto?
Right. I recall we started this project kind of late. I mean, if you recall, we had the spring of 1991, and then we wanted to get going with the fall season. But the fall of 1991, we didn't have any money because we had just submitted that proposal at that time. Then Laurie got the money at some point early in the spring of 1992, but we were able to use it until the fall, which was a really nice thing that we did our first season-long count in 1992, and we set 5 monitoring sites on that fall. we had, a whole line of monitoring sites all the way from Jalapa down to the coast. And again, we discovered that counting hawks up in Jalapa and in Cerro Gordo was a little more boring than it was down at the coast, where we were seeing massive numbers of birds. So halfway through the season, we decided to cancel the counts in Jalapa and Cerro Gordo and focus our attention in Rio Escondido, Cardel, and La Antigua. And we finished that field season with those 3 sites. We learned a great deal on those early field seasons. We learned how far inland those migrants were going. And we learned by comparing spring versus fall that the fall wasn't that bad a season to do a monitoring count. Our spring seasons are brutal here. It's the dry season, and down at the coast, temperatures can be super high. Observer fatigue was a problem. Whereas in the fall, and I'm not going to say it's a piece of cake, but it's not quite as hard on people as the spring is. So we decided after a couple more years of work to drop the possibility of doing spring counts and focus on the fall, and selected Cardel and Chichicaxtla as the 2 sites that we will keep over long term.
In that first fall season, I think it was 2.5 million raptors thereabouts.
Correct. That's when we broke the 1 million bird mark that we thought we will reach. By about halfway through the season, we already had 1.2 million or so, and we ended the season with 2.5 million birds. And another thing that we were expecting was a larger number of a lot of those northern migrants, a lot more sharpshins and Cooper's hawks and falcons. And instead, we found, we suspected and we knew from reading the literature that we will have a lot of broadwing hawks and turkey vultures, but we didn't know we would be getting quite as many Mississippi kites and Swainson's hawks. And I don't know if that was surprising to you, Steve, particularly Swainson's hawks, if you were surprised to find that many out here.
Yeah, I was. I sort of assumed that these Western Swainson's hawk populations would go down the Pacific part of Mexico on their way to Argentina. I didn't see the possibility that they would go all the way across the continent to the Gulf Coast and go down through South Texas and Veracruz, but that's what they do. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that we learned early on that it was a real challenge to count tens of thousands of birds passing over in a matter of minutes, and that an important part of the project needed to be to have well-trained observers that could count in groups of 10s or 20s or 50s or 100s when the numbers going over were great. And so we figured out the methodology to include not only 3 observers at each of 2 sites, with one group of 3 taking the day off every 3rd day to rest their eyes, which I think was important. But we also realized the importance of doing some pre-season training of the observers to check their ability to estimate numbers when we had these huge flights, and how we would split up the counts when there's birds going overhead and birds going over to the east and to the west, and a huge mix of species. So we felt that a protocol involving 3 observers at each of 2 sites, with 3 observers taking a day off on any given day. And we also figured on starting the count on the 20th of August and ending it on the 20th of November seemed to be pretty good standardized protocol for those particular sites and this particular project. And it seems to have worked well over the past close to 30 years now.
So one thing I wanted to say was that one of Lori's original concerns was about conservation. We weren't thinking much about the possibility of turning this into a conservation project. at the very beginning, except for identifying roosting sites, as Lori just said, but also figuring out what will be the most important threats for migrants. At that time, we just hadn't thought about it. We hadn't thought that sugarcane and cattle raising and pesticide use and other things will be major problems for migrants. And so we started sort of painting a conservation scenario for the migrants that were moving through. So I don't know, Lori, how or why you started thinking of these ideas, and if you could tell us a bit about it.
Well, I did. I mean, I was thinking about that first fall season. We actually had some funding for education. We were bringing people up to Hawk Mountain to do education internships with our educators here, just to see what we were doing. And there was a lot of back and forth from that year onward. But I was just thinking while you were talking that, do you remember that poster that we put together that was talking about the migration? And we got a bunch of them printed up. It had a map of the whole flyway and then some hawks on it. And then it was sort of supposed to appeal to the farmer because it showed the mice eating the corn and the hawk eating the mouse. And well, I never saw them in the field, but supposedly you guys put them all up and then immediately they disappeared because people were stealing them. So in some ways we felt like that was a good thing, but that was kind of funny. But as far as conservation, I mean, I think it was just, these are long distance migrants, and certainly they're so concentrated there that any kind of impact could have a great impact on at a population level. So trying to understand more about the habitats they're using was something that I was interested in right from the get-go, although it became very difficult, I think, for us to actually do that along with everything else. I mean, you did get some flights with Lighthawk, that volunteer pilot airplane group, to go try to follow flocks and stuff. And I think you did get some data on some locations where the birds were using. But yes, I mean, some of our more recent research looking at telemetred birds has actually provided some pretty good detail on that too.
But I think from a conservation perspective, one of the greatest contributions of the project has been just understanding the long-term trends of populations, particularly the four species, turkey vultures, Swainson's hawks, Mississippi kites, and broad-winged hawks. This is the place to monitor those four species coming out of North America in terms of the overall proportion of the global populations. Obviously it's probably greater than 95% of all those four species come through this bottleneck in coastal Veracruz. So none of the other sites anywhere in North America count anywhere as close to that percentage. Even Corpus Christi, Texas, which has counted over 1 million birds only one time, not compare with the 4 to 6 million birds that are being counted in Veracruz. And in addition to that, of course, populations of some of the waterbird species are being monitored quite effectively at this site. Species like the white pelican and the AVES and even hingas and several other waterbird species are wood storks, etc. So, and of course, some of the work that Bob Straub did also was able to document the amazing numbers of some of the passerine birds that come through there, including swallows and many species of songbirds. And of course, then the butterfly migration down there is pretty amazing as well.
Well, I mean, I would add to that, Steve, that, our own work collectively, Fundadores Veracruz in particular, has brought this place to the attention of the world. Yes. So, Nature Conservancy and Audubon and all these people, big conservation groups, are paying attention to this flyway, which is, bringing conservation I think hopefully bringing conservation attention to what's going on with the migrant birds.
Yeah, good point, Laurie. And Ernesto, one of the things we haven't touched on yet that you might want to talk about is the effort to launch the first ever major ending effort along this flyway, and what obstacles you encountered and how you were able to eventually locate, the best place to capture and end the birds, and what we've learned from some of that information over the last close to 30 years.
Steve, you cut off a little bit. You said banding?
Yes.
Okay.
Banding.
Okay. The banding, the idea and the possibility of banding migrants, was one of the early ideas we had. We had our training done in the Goshutes and later in Hawk Mountain, where we spent a lot of time capturing a lot of those migrants and putting bands on them and collecting a lot of information on the birds that we had in the hand for a little bit. The idea of having a banding station came up early on. I would say since 1992, we had that in mind. We submitted a separate proposal, like the grant that Lori got in 1992 was one of two grants. We had one that was, like a $6,000-7,000 grant that we got from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We looked for places to set up a banding station. So we found the place and we ran a banding station for about a month, and we had these really poor results. The banding station was placed too far inland for what we needed. So we dropped the idea for several years because we weren't looking for additional funding to continue the possibility. We thought that we will not be lucky and will not be successful catching a lot of migrants. So that idea stayed dormant for a number of years until we had Karen Schuerman from Golden Gate Raptor Observatory, who came down and said, like, oh, no, we can set up a banding station. I will do the fundraising. I will train people. I will get the equipment and we'll get it running. So Karen's energy and enthusiasm got us going in 1997. And later in 1998, it became another, formal part of the project, and we kept it going until very recently when funding and staff limitations have prevented us from running the station. So the possibility of learning a lot about migration through a banding station has been a fantastic thing. It has not been quite as successful in terms of the capture rates as what you find in the north. We know that this may happen presumably because migrants aren't that interested in eating at the time they are passing through here. So our capture rates of accipiters, for example, are lower than what you get in northern banding stations compared to Cape May or the Goshutes. We have fewer captures relative to what you observe. So, but still, the banding station, I think, on a good year captures 500 migrants, and that's a fairly good number. Most of them Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks, but many other species. I think up to 12 species have been captured there, including a lot of residents, a lot of gray hawks, a lot of Aplomata falcons, and other really interesting birds. But so the banding is another important part. Through banding, we have developed some connections between what you can get in Veracruz. We know that most of the migrants, for example, accipiters and Cooper's hawks, come from around the Great Lakes region. Sharp-shinned hawks mostly east of the Great Lakes region, Cooper's hawks from west of the Great Lakes region, from the southern parts of Canada and northern US, around that area, those areas. And we also know that the migrants that come from that part of the world and migrate through Veracruz make the longest migrations. Those are the ones who reach Central America, the birds that can be recovered as far as Costa Rica, Guatemala, or Nicaragua. So it's an interesting finding. It's an insight offered by our banding station. Band recoveries, as we all know, are even lower than capture rates. We just did an analysis a couple of years ago of Sharpshooting and Cooper's hawks recovered, about 83 records, I think. And that's not a lot for almost 20 years of banding. But I think it has provided insights on the importance of this site.
So here's a question for both you and Laurie. If you could encapsulate some of the most important scientific outcomes or some of the things we've learned that were new and important for conservation and management so far in the first 28 years or so of the project.
Go ahead, Ernesto.
Okay. I think the first and most important finding is putting numbers and just quantifying the migration here. As you mentioned earlier, the migration counts on a single fall season here range from 4 million to nearly 6 million. The mean of migration counts is of about 4.5, 4.6 million. I haven't done the math in recent years, but that's consistently been the case over many years. So there is no dispute now that this is the most important flyway for migratory raptors in the world. The early arrivals to our site were Eilat in Israel and the Isthmus of Panama. And those two sites get less than 1.5 million migrants. The Israeli migration monitoring site gets more species than we do because it's all the Eurasian raptors moving into Africa. But we get more birds. They also get a lot more aquatic birds, a lot more pelicans and storks and things that we get in fairly large numbers, but not quite as many. I think another important finding and another interesting discovery is the possibility of contributing to understanding what is happening to raptor populations. So I was saying that the other important contribution is that the migration counts that we get here in Veracruz are very critical for several species. In particular, broadwing hawks, Mississippi kites, and Swainson's hawks. We think that over 90 or 95% of the global population of those three species migrates through central Veracruz. And those are species that are not well monitored in other migration monitoring sites. For example, Hawk Mountain can have good numbers of broadwing hawks on certain years, and in other years, those birds seem to fly, over another area. So the natural variation of their flow of broadwing hawks doesn't allow for seasonal comparisons that can be quite as reliable as what you get in other places. I'm not aware of a single site that tracks Swainson's hawks in large numbers in a consistent way, or Mississippi kites. So for those three species, the data that Veracruz provides is invaluable for tracking those. So that's another important finding. I think there are several things. For example, distributional records. Some of those migrants that we are recording down here are either species that weren't known to migrate, such as hoop-bill kites and gray hawks and common black hawks that are regularly recorded on migration, and also distributional records such as golden eagles and bald eagles and ferruginous hawks and other things that aren't supposed to migrate this far south have been recorded here. So those are interesting discoveries that continue sort of illustrating the map of raptor migration in the Americas that before weren't well known. other smaller findings are coming out. Right now, we have a little study on ectoparasites and how they infest the migrants that we're capturing at the banding station. And we have found a few interesting things. The Cooper's hawk is one that has the highest diversity of parasites, thinking of flat flies and mites and several of those that are, in the feathers or feeding on dead skin in these migrants, whereas sharpshin hawks, for example, don't have quite as many different types of parasites. So that study is on the works right now. That was an undergraduate senior thesis that I advised a couple of years ago, and we're getting the paper ready to be submitted. There is also another study on the works on contaminants. We had a master's student, Megan Campbell, who looked at metals in the blood and feathers of migrants. And we basically discovered that migrants and resident species have similar levels of lead, mercury, and other metals. So the idea that birds come clean from the north and they get contaminated in the tropics is not supported by our data. We basically have data to demonstrate that the levels of contamination are similar. Birds come down already contaminated and they pick up similar amounts of contaminants when they are down here. So that's an interesting finding. So lots of discoveries. During the course of many years, we have collected, for example, bird lists and data on other migrants, and we have found, for example, 230 some species of neotropical migrants use the Veracruz coast flyway. That's about 2/3 of all the birds that migrate in the Nearctic neotropic avian migration system, and that's a huge number. That's 2/3 of all those land birds. That's another important finding that unfortunately we haven't been able to follow up on and further document. We need other tools such as radars or a monitoring system that is different and is not something that we could do at the same time as we are tracking raptors. But many things await discovery. This is a really neat place.
Yeah, something like following that, like all these like important like components of the raptor migration that bring the people's attention, and that's something I would like to talk about how the ecotourism became one of the crucial part. And I know Hawk Mountain was in the first groups to arrive as a Pro Natura's tour, but if you can discuss more about that. I don't know if Hawkwatch International also was participating on groups in the beginning, something like that.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that Steve and Ernesto and I had a great field trip one spring, because we knew we wanted to do ecotourism to try to get more funding for the project. But we decided we needed to check out all these birding spots before we started bringing groups there. So I think it was spent 2 weeks, or maybe it was 10 days, but it was more than a week. Just Ernesto taking Steve and I to all these great birding spots all throughout Veracruz. And I must say we had a great time. We should do it again sometime. But yeah, so we did that, and then we kind of put together a draft of a basic tour, which is still being used today. Basically, they tweaked it with different sites, but the first eco tour was in 1994, and I think it was Sharon Gahn, who was our education director, and myself brought a group down from Hawk Mountain. And I have some horror stories about the van that we rented. The moral of that story is we should have gone through Pro Natura to rent the van, but we rented it ourselves and lived to regret it. But But yeah, it was a good tour. We had lots of great places to go birding in the morning, and then we would go back to the hawk watch, just like is being done today. So I don't know, Ernesto, do you have any further comments on that, or Steve?
Yeah, one interesting part is that we didn't have a clear idea, and I'm saying we, the Mexican side of this collaboration, didn't have a clear idea what would be of interest to an ecotour. So we told Lori and Steve, all right, let's do a scouting trip, and we spent time here in Central Veracruz. We went down to Alvarado. We went to Los Tuxtlas as well. And we weren't exactly sure about what things will be of interest to the traveler. I mean, we knew that observing the migration will be one of the key things to highlight and to visit and to spend time hawk watching. We weren't exactly sure how interested people will be in places like visiting a ruin site or an anthropology museum or a waterfall to watch a roost of white-throated swifts, or going to a coastal lagoon to spend time looking for egrets and shorebirds in the nearby sandy beach. So a lot of that was was a time of learning for us to figure out how to compose an itinerary that was attractive enough for people, how people like a lot of action when they go to those tours. I mean, we ended up putting together basically 2 outings a day, one early in the morning. We get up before sunrise and have breakfast in the dark, and then we go out in the field, and we're done with that birding part by about 11 or so in the morning when we're back in the hotel. And then we have the midsection of the day as time to hawk watch or relax or do something else. And then we have an afternoon outing to go do something else, go visit another site or something that has a lot of bird activity in the afternoon. So at the time we had that scouting trip, and then later when Lori and Sharon designed the itinerary, it was from this collective discussion that the first itineraries came out, and as Lori said, a lot of it is still basically the same, rearranged in blocks, I guess. I think the tours and people coming from Hawkwatch International came after that. I can't recall that exactly. Steve, do you have any data there?
Well, I think the very first tour that Hawkwatch International did was either 96 or 97. And I was the representative from Hawkwatch International on that tour, and it was obviously very successful. And so we tried to do it on an annual basis, or in some cases every other year. But I left Hawkwatch International in '99. So then the commitment to doing those tours on an annual or biannual basis maybe was somewhat reduced after I left. But I tried to also do some tours with other organizations that I ended up working for, Audubon and so on. And so my understanding now is, of course, that a major part of the funding to support the count every year does come from these tours. And so I feel now with my Maryland Birding and Nature tours that I really want to try to do a tour down there every single year to support the project and make sure that the funding is sustainably developed for the long term, for the success of the project.
Yeah, we had a big learning lesson happening in during 9/11. 9/11 occurred right before the beginning of our tour season. So let's say if, in 2000 and the years before, the revenue from ecotours in our collaboration with other groups in the US had brought a growing amount of money into the project. And I believe at the height of our ecotourism era, we were raising about 1/2 of the total budget out of the total budget of the River of Raptors project out of handling ecotours. So it was a significant amount of money and a good business model for keeping the project running over long term. And then came 9/11, and the whole thing collapsed like right away. Within weeks, everybody canceled their tours. I think we only had one tour that decided to go anyway, and they came down, but we were down, tenfold. I mean, before that, we were doing 10 or 12 groups per season, and then we were reduced to one. So that was a major blow, and I guess the pandemic is teaching us another lesson, is that there are a lot of extrinsic factors that can affect a possible flow of cash into conservation, just because people cannot travel, and this is so difficult to plan, and a lot of uncertainties are out there. I don't know how things are recovering for you, Steve, but international travel seems to be kind of off the table for a lot of tour companies, or it has been over the last almost 2 years, right?
No, that is definitely true. And I have not done any international traveling since the fall of 2019. And I canceled the Veracruz trip in 2020, canceled it in 2021. And people are not comfortable traveling internationally yet because of the pandemic, and now because of the specific Delta variant. So I'm trying to run a tour to Ecuador in January. I don't have it at the minimum yet. Hopefully I'll get that in the next 3 weeks. But it's touch and go right now for my company. Is a financial disaster at the moment. Local trips is actually picking up. I'm doing more trips into Yellowstone and more trips to Red Rock Lakes Refuge, and more trips just right around Bozeman. So that's keeping me afloat to some extent in 2021, and it's helping to pay some bills. So hopefully 2022 will be a fresh start, and the international trips can resume in earnest. That's my hope, and we'll continue to be hopeful in that regard. But yeah, the pandemic has really been a challenge.
The other funding stream that we tried to initiate, or we did initiate to get private dollars and to support the project, was the Amigos program, where we established a membership or Friends of Veracruz River Raptors kind of thing. And a lot of those early years, the funding ran through Hawk Mountain, which made it easier to get US dollars. But that's become more difficult in recent years because of accounting changes and making it difficult for us to funnel money from here down there directly. But I still think an Amigos kind of program could be worked on. But obviously it's all linked with the ecotourism, because everybody that you're recruiting is probably somebody that visited there, but not always. When I think back on the history of the project, there are a couple of highlights that are, I think, important to mention along the way. And one was, from my standpoint, was building the observatory, which I'm kind of hazy on what year that was, but we got it.
I believe it was completed. I believe it was completed in 2006.
Yeah. Okay. So Ernesto, that was right after you were there when it got started, but then I think the next director was in charge when they finished it. Is that right?
Right. Yes, I left in 2001. Okay.
So, and I know we got significant donations from some generous donors, individual donors, but we also got a NIFWF, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant for that. And I think the idea was to try to garner more support within country, as well as to have a center for education and now a count site as well. So I think it does bring some cachet and some recognition to the project that, wasn't there before, when you're, using borrowed grounds and so forth. So that was one thing. And then the conference that you helped organize, Ernesto, after you left ProNatura for International Ornithological Congress, Was that in what year was that?
2006.
Was 2006? God, it seems so recent. Anyway, I mean, I thought that was one of the coolest days in the history of the project, when you're standing on the roof of Cardell in Hotel Bienvenidos, and every single inch is covered with these ornithologists from all over the world, famous names, you know, John Fitzpatrick and Ian Newton and Bill Clark, you know, all these people, and they're all saying, wow, look at those hawks. And they're all just like, this is so cool. And I mean, it just struck me that, you know, that this is something that we started, and it's finally getting the recognition it deserves.
Yes, just to get on that for a minute, Lori, the conference was planned to have 2 days of activities, then a day off, and then 2 more days of conference. So we were a little nervous about setting a fixed date for that day for people to go out and birdwatch. We had 1,800 people in that conference from 43 countries, and about 500 of them visited either Cardell or Chichicaxtla during that date. And it luckily coincided with an amazing flight. So a lot of people had a chance to, you know, enjoy the migration and get to see what was going on. And so we had, you know, 500 more people with the right message about the migration. And I was there really late in the day, and I still got to see a lot of those people that you mentioned, a lot of people who were very impressed with the migration, and it was a great day.
Yeah, and Mark Fuller, I don't know if it was the same day, maybe it was Mark Fuller, who's a, you know, very reputable raptor biologist and kind of the raptor biologist in U.S. Fish and Wildlife, or USGS, asked me to take him to the lookout. And then he was like grilling me on how are they counting these hawks? You know, that's just how he was. And so I had to sit there and explain to him how they're estimating the numbers and all this. But it was really an important time, because for those folks to see Veracruz counters in action and see how well it was done, it was good.
Wow, has been awesome memories. I think you probably like past the questions that we have in mind. So I don't know if you want to continue. I don't know if you have more time. I mean, it's up to you. It's already 5 o'clock.
Well, I did want to ask both Ernesto and Laurie about what they feel has been the impact of the educational component of the project. I don't think we've talked enough about that. And of course, you guys now have an annual festival to celebrate the migration. And obviously you've been doing a lot of work in the classrooms throughout the Central Veracruz communities. And I just wonder how much it has impacted the appreciation of raptors and raptor migration, and hopefully develop some local pride in what a special place Central Veracruz is for North American raptor migration, and just what kind of cultural shift maybe have occurred in attitudes toward nature and towards the birds, and especially the raptors, over the years. And well, how would you characterize the impact of the education program from this project on the local and regional communities and the culture and the appreciation of nature?
Rory, you want to go ahead with it?
All you. That's
Okay.
you.
All yours, Ernesto.
I think the impact of our education programs is one of the most difficult to evaluate, just because education is very difficult to track. One thing I can tell you is that the news about the importance of this migration site are not only well known regionally, but through the country and internationally, the place is well known for having this very important migration flyway. So the public got the news about it. I also think that locally, more specifically in the communities where we have done a lot of this work, children and teachers have been a part of either of our educational efforts, such as visits from our educators to schools, training workshops, visits to the observatory, just enjoying themselves in festivals and other things. So I think the message is out there. It's very difficult to track how effective this has been and whether education has turned, potential threats into allies for conservation. I would say the impact has been positive, but it's very difficult to demonstrate that. But other than that, the place is quite famous both nationally and internationally.
Yeah, just to add on that, like the community, like lastly, like the last, I will say 10 years, we have watched, like even in the town's fair when they're having the 15th of September, the ladies sometimes they dress and they put the birds on their dresses, like the migrants. And also you can now, like now is I don't know how to say it, probably Ernesto has a better idea, but every town now has their letters, like the town words with different drawings. And in Chichicaxtli, the center of Chichicaxtli letter has now a hug. So they have been now taking the migration as something that they own, something that they live around every fall, every year. And every time any Pro Natura person is out of the migration season, there is no one like there is always someone that asks you, hey, when is the migration start? When you're usually coming soon, right? Or something like that. So everyone knows in the town about the raptor migration, and they have it now as something that belongs to them, which is really, really cool.
And I mean, on a regional level, the Veracruz is the grandfather of all these Central American watch whites. Maybe that's the wrong word, but they're the leader that Costa Rica's looking to, and Panama and Colombia, and you're now training the other sites. So your methodology is looked at, and your how you're doing education. So it is the ripple effect that's growing out from there.
Yeah. In the last year, we have been involved with people with Costa Rica that they are trying to start the count. That this year there is the next year. I don't know how many years took for them to retake the count. And also we have the example of in Colombia with Esther, and she was able to be here as an intern, learn the methodology, learn how we do the things here, and then also participate with you in Hawk Mountain. And that also, so she now has like a lot of information that can be useful, and different views of how to get into people now in the Colombia ground. So that's something really, really exciting. And also the interchange of counters of people with a lot of experience that are now they're teaching others how to count, how to identify all the key elements for getting the right sightings and the right IDs and all that is around the whole migration phenomenon. It's great.
Well, I see the last question here. One of the last questions was, do any of us have any anecdotes that something that we remember fondly? So,
Yes.
I'll just start and just say that even though I've been down there for many, many years, I often was not on at an observation site where I could experience some of the biggest days, but there were a couple of days that I do recall where several 100,000 birds passed in a matter of hours. And I've experienced that both at Chi-Chi and at Cardell. And those are experiences I don't think I'll ever forget.
Yeah. I mean, you all get to see it every year, I guess, but those of us that come down infrequently get it every once in a while. But I remember some big days when Ruth Tingay was counting that year, and Jim Brett had a tour, and I think, or Jim and I had a tour, and I mean, it must have, I think that was a 400,000 bird day, and it was just, just amazing to see that overhead. That was in Cardell.
It can be quite inspirational to see those kind of numbers and realize that there really is a lot left in nature in the Western Hemisphere for us to work to conserve and to save.
I think there is an emotional connection that develops with the site after enjoying a day of heavy migration. I remember after that trip to Veracruz, Lori, after the conference, I saw a poem that was written by somebody, was published in the blog of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I believe it was Fitzpatrick who wrote it, but it was titled something like The Pinnacle of Life. And he was making a connection of everything that fits into a trophic pyramid, and how at the top is where all the hawks are. So you're looking at the pinnacle of life when you're looking at these migrants coming by in large numbers. It has been a great joy to have been a part of this project over the years. I have a lot of anecdotes, a lot of stories, and a lot of them are going away. Just today, I learned about the passing of a long-term friend of the River of Raptors project, Bill Johnston. He was a board member of the Lannan Foundation, and he was very important. The Lannan Foundation over the years was very important as a donor. They helped us in so many ways, and Bill Johnston was one of the key persons there. He was an amazing man, and it saddened me a ton. And so many names and people to thank for having this project running over the years. It's just hard to do. Lots of friendships, lots of stories that could be shared about every single season that has a particular important story to tell. Interesting things like the one year when we had several jabiroos migrating over Chichicaxtle, all those crazy records of golden eagles and bald eagles down here. The year when Steve and I swam across the mouth of a river to get to confirm a ferruginous hawk. You remember that, Steve, that we went with our binoculars outside the water, crossed the river, and walked up to this bird to just confirm it was the right one, and people were cheering up on the other side of the river. It was so much fun.
I remember that as if it happened yesterday. And I have to say, if I look at my career accomplishments, I consider my involvement in the launch of the Veracruz River Raptors project as one of the three most important accomplishments of my career, with Hawkwatch International founding and the creation of the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge for the masked bobwhite quail, endangered subspecies, among my three most prideful things that I've poured my life into.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks, Steve.
I have a great photograph that I'm gonna have to send you of. We used to sometimes try to Steve, Ernesto, and I would try to meet up in the Hotel Bienvenidos at least once every couple of years so that we could talk about how to keep the project going. And I have a photograph from way back of us sitting around the table. It's in my office at work. I'll have to scan it in and send it to y'all. But anyway, yeah, it's been a great project. I'm so glad I've been able to be involved and help get it started. It wasn't easy. It definitely, we probably are glossing over a lot of hard stuff. Raising that money was painful and didn't always work. I mean, there was one year, I think it was 95, that we just couldn't find the money and we didn't have a count. We didn't have a project, but except for some volunteer effort from Jorge. But yeah, it's doing well, and we continue to support you and hope to try to continue to help raise money through ecotourism and other ways.
Well, I guess one of the dreams I have is to create an endowment, make sure the Veracruz project never ever falters again.
It's a good idea, Steve. Yeah. Kashmir, I think he's volunteering to help you with that.
Yeah, I can work on that.
Well, I think $2 million in the bank, taking 4% a year, would make sure that both sites can be covered, and maybe even a vending station on an annual basis. And the education will continue, and the periodic analysis of the data and reporting those findings scientifically and online, I think has got to be an important goal for all of us to achieve in the next few years.
That will be something really, really mega useful. Yeah, and well, something you point, like we have to keep, or at least to save some of the money every year. So in 5 years or 7 years, we can, I don't know, maybe pay Ernesto or someone else to write an article to keep showing the results of this long-term effort and how things has been shaping. The raptor population index has been a great tool, but should be something like there is more data that we can share, and we can contribute to the science. As something like for the funding station, we probably should be now looking forward to deploy probably satellite transmitters, so that way the effort can be more directly to something specifically, but also like you reduce the amount of effort at the same time, because you will get more data with a tagged bird than with a banded bird. And probably using probably patches. Like I've been thinking on we should deploy at least wing tags on zontail hawk and probably gray hawks, that if we do not have the money to deploy a satellite transmitter on each of them, but at least since they're big birds, we can probably attach wing tags, and that way with a bunch of observers that they already are. And that's something really cool that is increasing the number of bird watchers in Mexico, and it should be the same in Central and South America. So that way you have more likelihood to find or to have a report of a target bird. Probably that's something that we should discuss later with Lori, like how often do they get reports from people and to have something, if it's going to be worth it to do, or I don't know, like it's something that has to be researched. That will be cheaper than deploying satellite transmitter for sure. Right now we're working on having the models station, and Ernesto is also involved in that project in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and also here in Veracruz. The plan is to have at least 4 antennas along the migratory corridor, and that will be something also to take on account. So probably we will be deploying these tags that are readable for the models. than just banding birds. So having the bands plus other tracking system.
Well, I think those are great ideas, Cash, and I sure hope we can find a way to do more of those kinds of tracking projects to find more details about the migration routes and some of the challenges that the birds face spring and fall as they migrate.
Yep. All right. Well,
Yeah, I want to thank Senator Veracruz for setting this up and giving us an opportunity to share the history and some of our memories of the project with anybody who wants to listen.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you for the invitation and for setting this up.
Yeah, thank you.